Sure. I think
Because from a historical point of view, that's
there we go. Yeah. I think that's a great point you bring up there. So I think that we can, even though as a Catholic I would approach them all together, I think from a historical perspective, do you think it would be fair that we could examine Paul's early letters, the earliest ones? And I don't mean the Deutero-Pauline corpus. I know people will argue for other ones to not be of dubious authorship. Looking at the early Pauline corpus and maybe saying, okay, well, look, maybe we don't have a whole lot of fleshed out details here, but we've got enough to show that he believed in the bodily resurrection of Christ. And he seems to even indicate that Christ appeared to him. Even if one were to say, look, St. Paul's just a liar, I think that really does come out clearly in his writings. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so one thing to say at this point, I'm not accusing Paul of lying.
Right, no, I'm saying that.
But the text is so unclear that it's really not clear whether what he had was something much more like a vision rather than a meeting with somebody who'd been dead and was now alive again, right? And my sense is that there really isn't anything in those early letters that supports the idea that
bodily,
that it was a bodily meeting of two bodies.
Okay. Okay.
Right?
So
that's just not the case. And if he had a vision, well, the content of visions can be anything, but as far as being a proof of something that had happened some years earlier, they're not worth much.
Okay, I get you. So you think that I'm glad that I understand now. I apologize. I was spinning the wheels. I didn't get you for a bit there. You don't think that the idea of a bodily resurrection in Paul's writings comes out very clear. Is that correct?
No, not at all.
Why would that be, though? I mean, because I read 1 Corinthians 15, and everything that I read seems to indicate that he believes that Christ appeared to him the exact way that he appeared to the others. And
right. Well, okay. And the way to read that is so the earlier appearances were visions too, right?
How would you get that from Paul?
From
1 Corinthians?
No, from Paul, because a plausible reading of what he's saying is that he's had a vision, right? He doesn't have the Gospels. He doesn't say.
Okay, but
it I don't think that it would have mattered to Paul, right? If all of these post-death appearances were just people having visions. I mean, anyway.
Yeah, no, I get you, and I think that's fascinating. But for me, I read Paul, and I think it's very clear that everything in 1 Corinthians 15, to me, seems to be of the bodily nature. I'm trying to think.
Okay, so let me ask you, how much of that comes from just being able to read that text in isolation, as opposed to reading it in the light of the Gospels?
Everything, because I've broken it all down in the particular Greek where he talks about the physical body and the spiritual body. So I've actually done a deep dive look into the Greek of 1 Corinthians 15 alone, because I know that in dialogues, I have a lot of atheist friends that I respect a lot of scholars, and I know that they, by and large, such as yourself, they would believe that 1 Corinthians 15 is earlier than the Gospels. But I think from St. Paul, when you read what he's talking about the mortal body and the spiritual body, I think it's a tangible, real physical body. I don't think there's any other way of reading 1 Corinthians 15 from him. But I have heard the arguments from Dan Barker and others where Dan seems to think that that the spiritual body is more of a kind of a immaterial kind of body, I guess, leaning more towards the Gnosticism kind of point of view. But I personally don't see that. I know you're probably going to think, well, of course not. You're Catholic. You don't want to see that. But perhaps your thoughts on that.
So, I mean, there's a kind of another point of view from which it's not well. I think that I know. So what I'm hesitating about is that I don't read Greek. So I would have to go and get somebody to explain the Greek to
Sure.
me. But on the
Sure.
scholarship that I've read, I think that there's quite a lot of scholarly support for the view that you can't get a kind of bodily meeting of bodies out of the text of Corinthians 1:15. So,
Right.
given that I'm not myself an expert, all I'm going to say is I'm in this position where there's lots of people who appear to be experts and they disagree.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. But you would agree, though, that we also do have experts, even scholars that are that I would believe to be liberal, that would believe 1 Corinthians is talking about a physical resurrection, even if
Sure,
they
there are definitely people who do that, but there are
right.
plenty of people who I regard as who, as far as I can tell, are also experts. People
Right.
who are experts in the history of the time, read the Greek and so on,
Yeah.
and take a contrary view.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. I
since
think you'll find
I'm not myself in that debate, the most I could do is to be agnostic.
right. Yeah. And perhaps maybe in the future, maybe if you ever do a deep dive and look at that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because maybe you'll say, well, William, yeah, you know what, I see your point here, and perhaps it won't change your mind at all, or maybe it would.
I think that's the other point. I mean,
Yeah.
it wouldn't, right?
Okay. It wouldn't.
Most likely it wouldn't, because while the questions about the texts,
Mhm.
just thinking about what how far do we go from alleged eyewitness accounts to
Uh-huh.
what gets written down, and what's the kind of transmission in between? Because after all, in that text, Paul is relying on witnesses, right? Other people have told him about the 500 and the various other people who are the witnesses to the
Mhm.
resurrection. That's not his personal observations. That's secondhand stuff that he's got, and that could equally have influenced him in the. So whatever happened to him, the kind of mental breakdown or vision or whatever he had, the way that he interpreted it could have been filtered through that stuff, which is interpretation relying on sources.
Mhm.
So,
But wouldn't it also be fair to say that, as a number of scholars, even Jewish ones, have pointed out, even though they may definitely not agree with Paul, that perhaps Paul was not influenced in a post-conversion kind of way, as he would have been converted by what he believed to have been a bodily appearance of Christ before him. Now, whether or not we believe that to be true or not, I think historically that is the case that is laid out in the book of Acts. So I guess my question to you would be that, if Paul, if he believes that Christ appeared to him bodily, and then later received more information as he goes to abode and stay with Peter, as we read of in Galatians 1, and then he does receive more information. How do we?
so,
What would you
so,
think of appearances to him? Yeah.
so I'm not okay. So here's
Mhm.
something else.
Sure.
Paul had been busy persecuting
Right.
Christians, right?
Hmm.
He knew about their beliefs, so he
Uh-huh.
didn't need to go and talk to Peter to find out what they believed.
Oh, right. No, I mean particular details that later get fleshed out in his
Yeah,
letters. I
right.
mean,
But
yeah, I
that's
don't mean
sure,
necessarily
but
about that. Yeah.
right. But on this point, right? It may well be that his construal of this as a whatever happened, sort of, at least some sort of vision, even if he construed it as a kind of bodily appearance, that would have been in the light of his prior beliefs about what Christians believed, right? Because he
Why,
obviously had
why would
been.
he have? I'm just curious. Why would he have had a hallucination of the bodily risen Christ? I'm just,
Why did he have this vision? I don't know.
that's a great
Psychology is strange.
question.
He may have been starting to be feel very uncomfortable about the way that he'd been treating the Christians.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. the thing is that we're kind of speculating about things that are themselves speculative, because the reliability of the text was the first thing that we wanted to establish. So in this case, I'm not inclined to dispute that Paul had some kind of episode on the road. Right. But then the causes of such episodes are many and diverse. And the question that we were talking about was what framed his interpretation of what happened to him. The cause of what happened to him could have been any of a number of things, because people have breakdowns under stress of all kinds.
He seems to indicate, though, from his letters, that Christ appeared to him more than once. So I mean, it to me, at least, it would call into question the kind of hallucination kind of thing. Now, whether or not
well, it depends. I mean, vision is a more generic term than hallucination. It's not clear. It's really not clear. What happened? But he said it appeared to him. Right, there were these appearances to him, or something like that. I assume that the Greek roughly translates.
Right. Yeah. It does indicate a bodily though, because he's saying that he appeared to him like he appeared to the other disciples. But I guess to me, and let me pose this to you. To me, it a vision, if you will. I know you prefer the term vision over hallucination. I guess the term vision to me just doesn't fit, because when I read his writings, it seems to me that he believes he appeared to him more than once and even dialogued with him. I mean, he'd be going quacko there. He'd be having whole conversations with the risen Christ.
So think about dreams and how we talk about them. Do you have bodily appearances? If you're in dreams, for example, and you may well talk about it that way, right?
But he does distinguish between.
So it wasn't a dream, but it may be another sort of state that's similar to dreaming in these respects, whatever the kind of vision is.
Sure. Okay. To me, and of course, I'm Catholic, so I believe that he truly did have a bodily appearance of Christ, because, but he clearly, when he's talking to his audience about kind of visions that appear to him, he distinguishes between visions and actual bodily appearances. You have that in the book of Acts.
So there's lots of opportunity for, and scribes did make interpolations into the text. And we know about this because we have earlier and later versions. Where we get into trouble is where we don't have earlier versions. So we've got a text and there's no earlier versions of it. And now there's this question about, what, given that there were sources, how reliably were they copied into the text that we've now got? Right? So we have, so I believe we have some pretty good versions for some of Paul's
we do.
letters. But
the Gospels as well. We have some pretty early stuff from the Gospels.
Pretty early.
Yeah. So the way I would turn that around and say, okay, well, look, I grant you that on Josephus, that's clearly an example of an interpolation later. And I grant I have not done as much research on the Josephus text as I wish I could have done. But let's just say, okay, that's a clear example of them interjecting, adding something to the text that really wasn't there beforehand. But by and large, with all of the tons of let's stick to New Testament or even Greek Septuagint manuscripts, you don't have, and let me call it text breaking. You don't have any text breaking kind of material in there, kind of like that, other than perhaps maybe if we debate the longer ending of Mark. But I think even if you look at scholarship right now on the longer ending of Mark, I think it's moving more towards the longer ending of Mark being original, even if people, of course, don't believe the historicity. I do, but I think scholarship is moving in that field of believing that the longer ending is the original one. So let me ask you this.
Okay, so let me
about
let me ask another question about this. Right? I know something depends on the dating here, but if you think that the Gospels are relatively late, like the earliest ones are written about 68 or 69 or thereabouts, that's that's a very long period of time where there's got to be transmission of information, right? So that I think Luke says writing down, what I'm doing is writing down what we believe. And
Right.
it's not, and that's what we believe now in whatever year.
Well, like a historian. Yeah,
right,
he was reporting
right.
like a historian.
But there's 2 generations roughly between the events that are supposed to be being reported and the writing down. And there's a question about the reliability of the information that even that someone who counts themselves as a historian, right? So,
Right. So,
and what you don't know is what sources he had, what was in those sources, and given his politics, how he selected what to include.
it seems like he writes a lot in the style of Thucydides, Luke. It really does seem he writes a lot in that style. Now, as a Catholic, I would say that Luke indicates in the beginning of his letter that he is undertaking meticulous research to compile this kind of information. But talking about
but what sort of research do you mean? Interviewing people, asking people what they think?
Interviewing people. I think Mary would have been one. I think he very clearly indicates that he spoke with Mary, and she would have been alive at that time. Historical record would show us she would have been alive. So I think the Virgin Mary, we believe that the Blessed Virgin Mary would have been one. Perhaps there are several others. Actually, we would believe there are several others. So,
so you think that Luke says explicitly that she was a source, that he interviewed her?
I think it's very, very strongly indicated when he preserves words that come off of her very lips that aren't preserved in any other of the gospel writings, in particular.
Right, but that seems like there'll be traditions. She said this, she said that, she said the other thing. He could have got.
But they're not preserved anywhere else, though.
He could have got them from who knows what. Right?
I would believe.
So I mean, this is kind of interesting, right? It's sort of a bit related to from a different religion, the kind of worries about the hadith.
No. Now that's way disconnected, Graham. The hadiths. Oh, no. That's several centuries.
There we have nice long, allegedly, chains of testifiers going back to
that's
kind of back to the source, right?
But you got to admit that's way later in history.
No, sure, it's way later in history, and I mean, there are kind of interesting projects that people have been undertaking recently where you pick a particular.
I have seen that,
and then you try to work out.
I'm baffled by that, Graham. I've got to be honest.
How reliable it is, but the question here is, we don't know. We really don't know who Luke's sources were. There's a long period of time. On his own account, maybe he talked to a bunch of people at the time, but we don't know who they were. And there's this kind of worry. I mean, it's amped up a lot, right, with the hadith compared to the Gospels, but that's because the period of time is largely because the period of time is 40 years as opposed to about 600 years or whatever it is. But
yeah, I would answer that there's a massive gap there, and then I would point out that I know that you don't view their testimony as being very valuable, but again, I look a lot at the early church fathers and the fact that they testify to him having interviewed various people, Mary being one of them. But even at that particular thing, even if we look at the early fathers, if we don't want to call them fathers for the sake of discussion, I don't know, early philosophers, early theologians that would have testified to that. But yourself, though, I just said it a little while ago as well. I don't think we have to rely on the Gospels, though, for the information, particularly on the resurrection of Christ. You admit the letters of Paul are much earlier. And if you look at the letters of Paul much earlier, they're not that far divorced from when Christ would have been crucified, and when we would have believed he would have resurrected. And you would admit, at least, even if you think it'd be erroneous or not, you talked a little bit about competing Christian groups. You would agree, though, right, that in terms of competing Christian views, Gnosticism or whatever other stripes of Christianity most definitely would not have come from the historical figure of Christ. We could agree with on that point, right? And the reason I say that is because you look at the enemies of the faith who are identifying particular markers of the Christian religion, doing so in a negative way, and identifying, and of course, they're criticizing it, saying that this man was killed and they worshipped him as a god. Every kind of identity marker in these enemies of the faith, as we would call them, pagan authors and what have you, they indicate that the group that followed the Christ believed these certain things, and we can identify those with the beliefs laid out in Scripture, as opposed to what the Gnostics would have believed. So even if we do have early on arguing groups of Christians, I think that we can point to one group that we could argue were the Orthodox group, tiny O, obviously, and the other groups that were perhaps not part of the fold of Christ, the historical figure. Would you agree with that, or do you think it's a little bit hazy? You're kind of looking like, William, it's not so easy. What are your thoughts on that? I think that's a fair way.
Yeah, so I mean, again, we're way out of stuff that I really know much about, but I would have thought that there were just, for the first couple of 100 years, really, up until at least the first council, there were just lots of competing groups. And I don't think anything was kind of signaled out as orthodox, because there wasn't anything that was orthodox until orthodoxy was nailed down, and that was the work of the councils.
You really believe that? So you don't believe that you can so okay, let me turn that around then, because I think it's very clear. Okay, let me focus on this. I guess let me shift the focus to the very first council of Nicaea, which I guess if we talk about orthodoxy there, we have the deity of Christ there that is nailed down. But you would agree that well before then, even in the Bible and even in the fathers before Nicaea, that they believed Christ to be God, right? You would agree with that, or you what are your thoughts on that? Because that wasn't defined at Nicaea,
right? So there's some very general claims, right, that were common to all of the Christians, but there were things that they disagreed about. And what the councils were about in large part was sorting out the things that they disagreed about, not the things that they, not the things they agreed on. So but the question about whether in the early years there were a bunch of people who, when you go through the process of all the councils, it turns out they believe basically what the sum of the councils ended up settling on, and that there was kind of a clear group that believed all that stuff. I'm not sure yet that I've seen any reason to believe that.
Well, okay, I guess let me turn it around on you then. What is the evidence that there were any other groups? Now I know Gnosticism and any other of those those kind of stripes of religions, but groups that weren't Gnostic, groups that didn't have the belief in kind of like a phantom like Christ. Do you know of any evidence? I know you said perhaps you haven't done a lot of research in it, but or maybe off the top of your head, any evidence of any other competing groups in the first 320 years before we get to Nicaea? I've looked at the historical record, and when I look at figures like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, even a Tertullian and Cyprian of Carthage and what have you, I see a continuity of belief that pretty much, even though it gets crystallized at Nicaea, I believe it gets crystallized because of the controversy that had arisen. I don't see any other evidence of any other, competing kinds of groups, if you will. Maybe factions arguing here and there, but competing theologies. Do you see any evidence of that, or maybe off the top of your head, anything that comes to you?
Competing theologies,
right? Maybe on competing theologies in terms of anything crystallized at any of the councils.
So um, the, there are, long after the councils, there are lots of groups that are kind of vaguely Christian that have competing theologies. They're called heretical groups, and they tend to get terminated with extreme prejudice. It would be very surprising to me if you couldn't find, evidence for at least some of those heresies.
Right. Yeah. No, there's no doubt
prior to the councils.
Well, yeah, there's no doubt that after the councils, a bunch of heresies rose up, and I don't think any of them, Graham, were ever fully extinguished. I don't think they were. Even if we think that, even if we want to argue that Arianism was stamped out or what have you, today you've got Jehovah's Witnesses that are more or less modern day Arians. So you've got that, but I guess my question more or less was, before the councils, before anything, I guess, is hammered down in dogmatic fashion, before any of the ecumenical councils, maybe the first 7 or what have you, do you look in the historical record and do you see any kind of competing, theologies from within that church that we can at least identify from the enemies?
Okay, so
you know what I mean now. Okay.
I mean, one thing here is that history tends to get written by the standpoint of the winners, right?
Well, and we still have evidence from the enemies.
There may have been a lot of evidence at one point, but we've lost it, or it's been destroyed. It just strikes me as kind of not very plausible that while you keep getting all of these divergences, heresies arising amongst people who are broadly kind of the brethren, after the councils, there was no similar diversity of opinion prior to the councils. That just seems like that's just way too neat.
That's right? Fanciful.
History doesn't go that way.
No, you're definitely right. No, you're 100% right. In fact, well before Nicaea 1, you have a forerunner to Arius, which would have Paul of Samosata, I believe, very similar to Arius. Yeah, no, I don't mean it was a neat kind of a picture all the way through. What I mean is that when you have these enemies of the faith identifying the group of followers of the Christ they viewed him as a resurrected kind of, not resurrected, they viewed him as kind of crucified kind of criminal. The way they identify the followers of the Christ is in identity markers that would fit with the Orthodox Christians, not with any other groups. Okay, so we can agree upon that.
So that means you've got some sources. It might get preserved not because of that fact, but because of detailed ways in which it presents things that later people really wanted to be true about the early Christians.
Well, we could very well say, though, that we have no idea who made that interpolation. What if it was a fringe Gnostic group or a fringe,
so,
you know what I mean? There's no telling that was done by a, for instance, a Catholic monk or a Catholic bishop. We really don't know how on earth that even occurred. You would agree with that?
Right, but that kind of skeptical thought is, I think, completely appropriate if you're taking a historical approach. Because it's just in line with the general point that I'm making about all the gaps in the historical record that tend to, undermine being too confident about going from the materials that we've got to, okay, so all this stuff really happened just as it's said that it happened.
You would agree, though.
So that point that you just made, I feel, is correct, but maybe doesn't exactly support overall the position that you're arguing.
I just can't imagine too much theology being extrapolated from that interpolation in Josephus. That I really stop and I wonder what really what group or what individual would have put that in there. I don't think it. Who knows? We can never really know, I guess. But
okay, but the point would.
Oh no, I get your point.
I assume the point would be that it was. I mean, what people wanted to say was, look, even in the 90s, right, there were people who were not friendly to Christianity who recognised that Christ
yeah, good point.
Messiah, right?
Great point.
And,
yeah, no doubt. Yeah, that's quite a fanciful reading of Josephus, but you don't have that kind of a challenge in the enemies of the faith writings. But of course, they're not speaking favorably. They're two different worlds. One is Josephus, who is an early, perhaps I imagine, the earliest Jewish historian, I believe, right, post New Testament, that is writing. So you've got different worlds. You've got the enemies of the faith that are not speaking favorably, that I believe are hostile, positive witnesses. And then, of course, you've got this text, which clearly is different because they're trying to make somebody who was clearly an enemy of the faith. Josephus was not a Christian. There's in any way, and they're trying to make an enemy of the faith favorable towards the Christian faith as more, I guess, perhaps testimony. But you would agree that we have absolutely no clue who would have, interjected that. You even agree it could have been a completely heretical Christian faction. There's no telling that it would have been a bishop or a monk or what have you. You would agree with that, right?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with that, but what I'm skeptical about is that the sort of confidence that where the writings of people who were, explicitly anti-Christian writings, where they ended up getting preserved, that the reason why they got preserved was because they provided clear evidence of some form of recognition of something that was useful to people at the time that the decisions were being made, that they wanted to preserve. And this came up in the context of the kind of orthodoxy question about orthodoxy, that you could tell a story drawing on these particular texts, even though, even our enemies recognize that the Orthodox story, that what we now think was the Orthodox story, was the Orthodox view back in 120 or whatever.
So then let me turn it around and point out how, as far as I am aware, these particular texts are not contested. Now, I have looked at a lot of these writings of early enemies of the faith, of Lucian and many others. I know some are contested. I'm not talking about the ones that are contested as having interpolations, but you would agree that there are some that are not contested by scholars, that there really isn't a big focus on the early Christians. It's just kind of like narratives being told, histories being related, and it's just, passing, as you pass through the writing, it makes mention of this Christian group. I think that there are certain writings that you can make a good case or not, have not been tampered with. Wouldn't you agree that perhaps if they had been tampered with, maybe there would have been a more in-depth kind of explanation of the Christian faith, and maybe we'd have more scholars arguing that they were tampered with? I mean, I guess my question to you is, if they don't give any indication of having been tampered with, kind of like the Josephus one, which very clearly has been messed with, including a lot of scholars believe that. I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Certain enemy writings.
So I wasn't thinking about them as being tampered with. I was thinking about them as having survived and being extant because of certain things that they said. I mean, I'm assuming that as time went by and the Christian faith slowly started to have more adherents, that there would have been more people writing negative things about Christians. I mean, there would have been lots of pagans, right? And
a lot of it probably is.
And so now here's a guess that lots of those writings, as for lots of ancient writings, generally ended up not being preserved.
Sure,
but there were various points in history where decisions had to be made about which manuscripts to keep and which ones not. And so I'm considering as a hypothesis that it's possible.
But you admit that that's just a thought. You don't. There's no evidence
sure,
for that.
sure.
Okay.
That there are, that it could have been, right, that what evidence you've got from the writings of pagans for orthodoxy being widespread prior to the councils
no,
is
I don't think it was
actually a
widespread.
kind of selection effect rather than.
I wouldn't believe it would have been widespread. No, I think in fact I would believe that the early Christian faith, until you get to very well Constantine, I would believe it would have been relatively small. Christianity had not even been legalized yet, so I don't believe it would have been widespread. I would believe, though, and you can tell me if you view this to be problematic or you see any holes in it. Love for you to poke holes through it. What I would argue would be that by virtue of the way the New Testament lays out its hierarchical structure, a leader of the church, bishops, priests, deacons, you have that very early on, first century, as early as the first century. And then you have that, as messy as it may be, as all the fighting you may have and all the ugliness you may have, you have that throughout history, all the way leading up to Nicaea. And you have that in a structured kind of format that I would argue is very clearly the Catholic Church throughout history, before we even get to Nicaea. And that particularly to me seems to mean, even though it's not as clean as perhaps maybe I indicated earlier, there are inner fightings, people challenging the authority of the Bishop of Rome, schismed groups, Gnostic groups, and what have you. You still can make a good case, I believe, historically, for a hierarchical church that the historical figure Jesus of Nazareth would have founded, as laid out in the Gospels and the writings of Paul, and then throughout early history. What do you think of that? Do you think that is, even if you may not agree with what that church taught or believed, do you think that that's a fair assessment of the early church, early history?
So I guess I don't know. I don't know enough about what happened. I mean, amongst all the other things I don't know enough about what happened with the diaspora after the Judeo-Roman
the Jews.
War.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So because at that early stage, the Christians are still just a Jewish sect. They're still Jews. They, from the point of view of the Romans.
Right, from the point of view of the Romans, until a little bit later, of course, they would.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, after Constantine, things look very different, but you don't have to go that far down before it looks different.
Sure, you can get to
a but there are sort of interesting Christian churches, like the Syrian Christian Church. Maybe
right.
That are rather different from Rome. So, are you?
Do you mean the Syriac Orthodox?
Yeah.
Or do you mean the Syriac? I mean, they really aren't that different. In terms of what do you mean? Like now we can look at figures like early writers in history that were Syriac writers. They write in a very different style. But if you look at today, the Christologies and the Trinitarian theology of Syriacs and the Roman Church, if you will, even though they utilize different language, they're virtually saying the same thing. They've even signed joint declarations in Christology. They believe the same thing in terms of Mary and Christ. So they really aren't that different. And when you're talking about the Syriac churches, first church to, we believe, schism off in the 400s, a lot of it having to do with, inner fighting and political stuff there. They really aren't that different. And if that is the case, you would agree that at one point in history, at least, even if you think it's 4th century, there was a kind of unified version of Orthodoxy.
So let me ask you another question, because that's not the most famous schism. So,
yeah.
So the
Eastern Orthodox. Yeah. The Great Schism, Eastern Orthodox. Yeah. So I guess the major difference between the most famous schism, as you know very well, the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic, would go be the papacy, of course. That would be the greatest difference. Outside of that, I don't see very big differences. They may utilize very different language, but they pretty much believe the essentials. They believe in transubstantiation. They believe in the Trinity. They believe in the same Christology. I mean, we share 7 councils together, where a lot of these things were crystallized. So, I mean, we're not that different, So there is a kind of, even though it's not complete uniformity, there's a lot in common with what we call the apostolic churches. And then we believe that the evangelical ones are just on another planet. So you would agree that Eastern Orthodoxy, Syriac, and Catholic, they have a lot more in common than perhaps we would with evangelicalism. You would agree with that?
Okay, so this is interesting. Maybe we can move on and talk about this for a little bit.
Yeah, no doubt.
Because so the Reformation,
which is later.
We're now jumping way ahead in history. Is, in your view, something more than a schism?
No doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. I think that maybe Luther maybe had good intentions to begin with of reforming the church, but I think that ultimately what he did was create a whole different religion. I think that he eventually went into doing that as his theology just metamorphosized to the point where it became the Protestant revolt, we would call it. And then later in history, you look at Calvinism, you look at Calvin Zwingli, Francis Turretin. As you go later into history, you have this Protestantism is not united. They have differing views in terms of soteriology and various other things. So, I mean, I would view the Protestant Reformation to be much more than a schism. I think it's a whole different religion.
So there were plenty of precursors to the Reformation.
Sure. Wycliffe.
The Patarines in Milan in the 11th century. There's a whole lot.
Oh yeah, sure.
There's a whole lot of whose interest was in reforming the church, because they thought,
no doubt.
especially they were worried about clerical corruption, but there's a bunch of other things. So, I mean, So
you're right. Yeah, you've had people throughout history that have attempted to, I guess, reform the church, if you will, and cleanse certain kinds of corruptions, if you will. The way we would look at it, though, Catholics, is we would say that Luther may have had that intention to begin with, but took it way too far from just being a kind of clerical kind of reform, or just the idea of kind of reforming corruptions, to just really creating his own religion. Because you look at these other groups that you mentioned from the 11th century and what have you, I can think of the Waldensians, if you will, as well.
Yeah. And Bogomils. There's
right. And we have a lot of the writings preserved where they believe in transubstantiation. They believe in the certain things about Mary, and they believe in purgatory, prayer for the dead. And then you get to the Reformation, you have a kind of shedding of these things. Whereas these other groups, I believe, were trying to reform the church from within. I think you have something very different with Luther. Maybe that was his intention originally, but I think it ends up being something completely different. Now, of course, my Lutheran friends are not going to agree with me. They're not going to agree with me. But then again, my Lutheran friends are going to say, well, Calvin made a mess of things, and they're going to say Turretin made a mess of things. So, you think you clearly have different Protestant religions where we're just so different as opposed to Eastern Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Syriac Orthodoxy.
So I wonder whether your Greek Orthodox friends will agree with you about the closeness. Right.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right there. The Greek Orthodox and even Rokor, even Russian Orthodox, very, very, it seems like a lot of them really think that we are far more apart than we are. But there are a lot of scholars that think that we are not that far apart. For instance, you have plenty of Orthodox that have no issue with purgatory, and you've got it there in one of their synods. You have a lot that have no issue with the Immaculate Conception, which by and large, a lot of Greek view that as Latin. But a lot say, well, you know what? This is compatible with our kind of theology. I really don't think we're too far apart from that. I really don't. Maybe a lot of it is language, but they view us as an apostolic church with valid apostolic orders. So, they can't dislike us that much. You know what I mean? You think it's okay? Let me ask you this: what would be what do you think, other than the papacy, would be a massive divide? Maybe, I guess, church breaking kind of divide between the Orthodox and Catholic. I mean, outside of the papacy, I think we're very close when it comes to Mariology. I think the Immaculate Conception is compatible. I don't see a huge gap there. I think we're all at the same table, where the Protestants are not even they're not at the table. They're not even in the room, but we are at the table with our Orthodox brothers and sisters.
So what's the Catholic view about the sort of Greek fathers?
The Greek fathers, yeah, we share them in common. The early fathers, the early Greek ones, we will hold them and share them in common. Where we will diverge would be probably when you get to the...
So Basil and...
Basil the Great, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nyssa. Yeah, we would hold all of them. We venerate them. They have their saint days in our church. So we hold them in common. Where we would diverge, of course, would be saints that the Orthodox would hold, such as they believe Mark of Ephesus is a saint from around the time of the Council of Florence, and we would not hold him to be a saint. So, there are certain figures there that they venerate that we don't venerate. But as far as early church fathers and what have you, we by and large we share the same ones.
Right. So the later history. I mean,
later.
I'd never previously heard of Mark of Ephesus, but that's kind of interesting. I'll try to remember that factoid for
you're gonna
the future.
You're gonna like it because he is a major figure. He was the one that held off from signing reunion at the Council of Florence. So reunion, by and large, did not happen because of Mark of Ephesus. So, of course, today Catholics don't view him as a saint, but they view him as a great saint of theirs. So, no doubt, you get to a certain time in history where they have figures that had very strong things to say against the Bishop of Rome and against things that they viewed to be particularly Catholic. There's certain ones that we wouldn't hold in common. I take it you probably have a good amount of Greek Orthodox friends.
Well, I have some.
You have some. Yeah. And they're not very favorable to Catholics, right? Some are.
Well, see, it depends. Like you can be, it's like amongst my Catholic friends, some of them are pretty close to nominal Catholics, whereas others are very gung ho. And so it depends where you sit on the kind of spectrum of, I don't know, maybe it's not a linear scale, but anyway, I'll suppose that there's this kind of scale of religiosity. So there are that, whether you're really invested in your Catholicism or not, for example.
Yeah.
And so the same for my Greek Orthodox friends. I mean, some of them are Greek Orthodox, but not hugely invested in it. So.
Yeah, they're not hugely invested. I guess it really is the same for pretty much any religion, right? I guess that's a good. Do you have any Syriac Orthodox friends? That's a good question. Not a whole lot of people.
No, I don't know anybody who's volunteered to me that they're Syriac. So
one of these days, I'm going to have you on with a really near and dear friend of mine who is a Syriac scholar. He's a subdeacon studying at a university. He is very, very kind and gentle-hearted. He is Syriac Orthodox, and even though I tell you right now that we share so much in common, it would maybe not seem so on surface level, as they utilize very different language when it comes to Christology and the Trinity, although you unveil it all and it really ultimately is saying the very same thing.
So it'll be worthwhile getting the Syriac perspective on that, because
no doubt,
because their view might be different. Their view might be that there's a kind of intellectual imperialism here, and on the part of Rome.
Well, they have signed joint Christological statements, so we're much closer to one another than when we were perhaps in the 500s. If you know what I mean. Which would even be the case with certain Lutheran groups and Catholics where certain Lutheran groups will say, well, look, when we talk about faith alone, it's more in this particular sense, and it fits in with the Catholic view of a living, active kind of faith, working through love. But, I think a lot of these groups have made, I guess, inroads into really communicating more with one another and seeing what we have in common more than what we don't have in common, which really was, was a lot at the Reformation. Now, let me ask you this: do you think the Reformation was more of a schism than a completely branching off of a new, different religions? What is your view on that?
So the individuation of religions is a kind of tricky thing. So
Yeah.
I had in mind to ask you about kind of interfaith initiatives in the last 50 years and the kind of distance between Catholicism and Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. I mean, there are obvious differences in various kinds of ways, but there are also certain kinds of similarities as well. So I think of Christianity. I mean, in terms of world religions, one of them is Christianity, one of them is Buddhism, one of them is Hinduism. And so you get lumped in together with the Protestants because there's a whole lot of things that you have in common, including scripture, history, there's a bunch of stuff. So the things that seem enormously different to you and that make you want to say they're a different religion, to me,
you, they're not.
I'm just going to say, well, no, these are just branches of the same religion. It's a kind of interesting question whether you should see Christianity and Judaism as just branches of the one religion, probably. And yes, then what about Islam? Because its relationship to Judaism's not very different from Christianity's relationship to Judaism. So, but people do talk about the Abrahamic religions, right? And that gives you a kind of genus. And then we'll talk about the kind of Eastern religions, and we'll talk maybe about the Indian ones, so the Sikhs and the Buddhists and the Hindus and the Jains and a few others. And I think they're distinctively different, not only, but primarily. Not so much for their view about ultimate divinity, although of course they tend not to be Trinitarians, but but their views about ultimate divinity are not always very different. Although they tend not to go in for creation. So the big differences have to do with karma and reincarnation, which really do make significant differences from Christianity.
Oh yeah, no doubt. As Christians, we don't believe in reincarnation, as you know that very well. In terms of interfaith dialogue throughout, as you know very well, there has been a kind of a push for interfaith dialogue throughout the past several decades. I think there's a proper way of having it, and I think there can be a negative kind of way. I don't myself applaud the kind of, hey, well, we all believe the same, the kind of, hey, you don't need to become a Christian. You don't need to follow Christ. Of course, as a Catholic, I would believe that everybody should become a Christian, should become a Catholic and follow Christ. So I think there's a positive way of interfaith dialogue, of looking at what we have in common and then doing what I believe St. Paul did do in the book of Acts, of calling people towards evangelizing people. So I think there's a proper way of interfaith dialogue, as long as it calls, as long as the call to evangelism is there.